All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, March 16th of 2022. 12-game NBA slate on tap for tonight. One of those strange NBA weeks here where we had the big Monday slate, the 4-gamer last night. Tomorrow's just one game, I think maybe because of March Madness getting started. Not really entirely sure why there's just a random Pistons Magic game tomorrow, but 12 games going on tonight. So should be a lot of fun. We probably will have some late swap craziness, some right up against lock news breaking, but definitely I think I probably prefer the 12 games to the 4 games if I could have my choice. But anyway, we've got quite a few questions in our queue here for today. A lot of different topics. We'll get into things in just a moment here. But before we get started, another announcement that tomorrow during this time block here for office hours, we'll be having Will on here talking about our new MMA sims and also a little bit of MMA DFS strategy. I mentioned it every single day this week, but Will took down 100K in the big contest for MMA last weekend, just the day after we pushed out the MMA sims to the app that Will himself had a huge hand in basically creating. So a really awesome opportunity to get to talk to Will tomorrow, and we'll be answering questions live on stream. So if you have questions for that stream, again, anything about our new MMA sims, MMA DFS strategy, overall, anything related to that, you can pop those questions into the Office Hours channel in Slack. I'll be taking notes of everything that kind of comes in over the next couple of days to make sure to make sure we cover it on stream. And then we'll also tackle any questions you guys have live on stream. So really looking forward to that tomorrow. Definitely recommend tuning in or at least catching the recording of that if you can't make the live show. But without much further ado here, let's get into it because we have plenty of questions to cover here today. I'm going to go ahead and just get started here in about chronological order just because there's a lot to get to here today. And I'm going to start with a question from Andrew here. It's a little bit about the nuance of the NBA sim. It kind of follows up with what we were talking about yesterday. We'll hit this real quick. He said, so you got my gears turning on correlation again. This is kind of going back to yesterday. There was a lot of MVP discussion with Embiid and Jokic playing earlier this week. Saw this stat comparison posted online. Makes me wonder if SaberSim correlation and simulations take into account defensive statistics aside from scoring stats. Does the sim assume matchups on the floor? So when player X with a strong defensive metric is on the floor, does it inhibit player Y's scoring ability, which leads to a negative correlation? Or is correlation mostly offensive pace score / differential based? I would say, so I talked to the models team here. It's a little bit, the way I would describe it, a little bit in between those two options. We have an understanding of the defensive strength of the team that's on the court together. It isn't done entirely on an individual player versus player level. And the sim isn't saying this player is literally guarding this player on this specific play or to that extent, but we have an understanding of which players are on the court, what the rotations look like, obviously, which combinations of 5 players are likely to see each other on the court, but also an understanding of what the defensive strength of a defensive unit is. And if it's a strong defensive unit as a whole, we will inhibit or we will adjust the shot-making potential or the rates of certain offensive events happening for the team playing on the other side of the court while they're out there. And I think that does a pretty good job representing how this actually ends up playing out, right? Basketball is kind of a fluid game. Teams are going to switch in the pick and roll. You're going to have situations where a player's posted up against a different player down low, right? There's generally a plan for one player to stick on another. Maybe there's a situation where a team may employ kind of more of a defensive specialist to shut a player down, but we think about this mostly in terms of the 5-man units that are on the court and what the defensive strength of that entire unit is. But it is captured in the sims. So, but good question there. I wanted to touch on that because that kind of follows up from what we were talking about yesterday. And for now, let's go ahead and keep it going. Next question from CJ. Hit this one real quick. CJ said, when using percentiles, do you think using the 25th percentile would be a viable strategy? I haven't really looked into it, but I thought it would be interesting having lineups built from the floor projections. Any thoughts? Thanks. I probably would avoid this, right? The main reason why we don't want to use floor projections, I'm going to drop that back, set min salary down a little bit, build some lineups here. Nobody's getting paid for a floor outcome, right? That's kind of ultimately at the end of it here. Why I probably would avoid doing this. We don't want to optimize for the floor, and we don't want to sort our lineups based on what lineups perform the best at the floor outcomes. So I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't think. I think what I would say is that, as a tool for visualizing downside, I think there's something interesting about looking at the 25th percentile as kind of a research tool, especially for chalk, right? If you're trying to figure out, where is ownership inefficient? What downside do the potential chalkiest plays on a slate have? I think that can be an interesting way of going about that, right? Especially, looking at value plays as well, right? What's I guess not a lot of info out on this particular slate at the moment here, right? I don't know what the value plays are with the mean projections either. But I do think, as a way of checking, against the best overall projected plays, right? What's the potential downside? How bad could it get? I think it could, give you a bit of a tool of figuring out where you want it to fade chalk. But I probably wouldn't optimize or use the percentiles at the 25th projection to take with you into your final set, or take with you as your final set of lineups. I mean, with that said, it's probably not killing you to do that, purely because the lineups, if you change your percentile to 25th in step 3, you are still picking from a set of 20 lineups that is from your pool of 500, of which we believe all of which are viable for the contest. You're just picking a selection that's optimized for a floor projection, which I think is slightly suboptimal, but it's probably not killing you. I just don't think it would be the route I go, again, because that's not the particular outcome that we're shooting for. But happy to talk a little bit more about this, CJ. I'd be curious too, also to hear from your perspective, why where your head was at on this, I guess, would be a good way of putting it. Because I am open to, I don't know, hearing I guess a counter argument here. So anyway, let's keep it going. Profit asks a question about late swap. Let's get this one up in here. Should late swapping be done arbitrarily or when there's late breaking news? Well, I probably would say definitely not arbitrarily, right? I think the strict answer here, or like the best practice recommendation, is if a sim runs for a game, you are probably best off late swapping to account for that. You can see if sims have run with this last updated timestamp in the upper right up here. That'll just show you when the last time we updated is. Also, if you're in Slack, clearly Profit, who asked this question, is in Slack because the question came in through Slack. But for those of you that are not in Slack yet, we have an NBA lineup alerts channel in our Slack that'll show every single time we sim a game. It's also plugged into the Underdog NBA Twitter, so you can kind of see when news breaks or a starting lineup comes out, and then the sim will run, and then the sim will complete. Again, the strict best practice here would be to late swap every single time a new sim runs, because it means that there is potentially something that changed that could be taken advantage of. Now, from a practical standpoint, I think you can use a little bit more discretion about that. I have mentioned before that one of my favorite tools is the Basketball Monster Player News dashboard, which will show you if this is a pretty good running dashboard of news that has broken. So there are situations where a sim may run without news having come out. Most of the time, if that happens, it's because there is a minute that is adjusting for a particular player by maybe 1 minute or something like that, or a rate for a player is very slightly changing, but there may not be like any associated news with it. Again, late swapping in that situation is never going to hurt you. At worst, it's going to be neutral EV. But from a practical standpoint, right, there's time needed to late swap every single time a sim runs, right? That's kind of a time intensive approach. So what I do is I will keep an eye on sims as they are running throughout the night, mostly in the Slack channel. Keep an eye out, if sims are running at, especially as the slate goes on, right? And we're getting more and more starting lineups. If sims are running at 6 o'clock, right? I'll go and take a look, normally over here. Did we get is a player starting that wasn't expected to start? Did somebody get ruled out? What's going on? Another thing I will also do is I will go into my entries editor and click into the entries and kind of see what is my exposure maybe to some of the players in this game. And seeing, did projections change, right? Am I really highly exposed? Last night, for example, is a really good example. So last night, the Pistons lineup, and I actually talked about this in Slack, right? So the Pistons lineup came out a little bit late, just a little bit after lock. There was some discussion in Slack about the starting lineup and if it was a good opportunity to late swap. And what I actually went in and did is I checked my exposures in my entries editor to Detroit. And what I found is that I had a ton of exposure to Killian Hayes, which, well, I wouldn't say a ton, but I had 20% or so exposure to Killian Hayes, which seemed a little strange to me, given that his average projection was 4.5x. He was projected for like 17.5 points. I actually think I had a min projection filter at 18 points last night, which was a big flag, because if that was his projection at lock, I would have never gotten him in the first place. And that was a good key to me that, yeah, something changed here. In this case, it was Rodney Magruder starting. That meant I needed to swap. So those are the kinds of things I use. Again, I arbitrarily, as the way this question is written, to me sounds like just kind of swapping randomly. I don't think you should do that by any means. I think the best practice, if you are unsure of when to swap in NBA DFS, you should swap every time a sim runs before the start of the next game, right? That's, I guess, the specific way to say it. So you'll set your lineups at lock, 5 o'clock, right? Provided that there is a sim that runs for any game after that, swap again before 5:30. Then provided that there are sims that run for any game after that, swap again at 6, and so on. And I think that's a good place to start. And as you get a little bit more familiar with the NBA news cadence and get a little bit more comfortable being able to identify if projections have changed or if news has broken that is significant enough to late swap for, you can start using a little bit more discretion. But I would hate for anybody to watch this or listen to this and make a decision not to late swap when it was clearly optimal to do so, just because you felt like you didn't need to. Because late swapping when you don't need to is never going to hurt you. That is always neutral EV. That all that is it's going to slightly reshuffle your lineups around with the same information you had at lock, but you're not going to be hurt by that, apart from the time it takes to do it. So if you're unsure of when to late swap, just lean on the side. And I do that too. If I'm truly unsure, if I'm like, man, did anything change? Do I know if I need to late swap? Especially, there's situations where the slate's going on and I get everything in and maybe it's around 6 or something like that and start cooking dinner and you step away for a bit and you're unplugged for a bit. And then you come back for those night games and starting lineups have come out and a bunch of new sims have run and you're not really sure if news actually changed anything. I will always late swap in that situation because I don't know. Right? Maybe there's something that I missed. Somebody weird starting, and there's like now a decent value play tucked into one of these games. Right? It's just worth late swapping. So anyway, good question though. Let's move on for now. Okay, so a couple questions from Kick to the Head here. Let's get into this. I see maybe another note about the percentiles here. He said, I use the percentiles column aggressively in my player pool selection. Is there a way to view and sort the columns by 30 to 30, 35, 40, 45 points to see how often they hit those? Example, if I want to sort the players by their highest total amount players hit their 50th percentile of 35 points, can we do that? If not, is this something that will be added? The value in being able to see more detail into percentiles is massive for my style of play. Okay, so it sounds like what you're describing to me is like the opposite of the percentiles, right? Rather than saying Giannis hits 74.3 fantasy points 15% of the time, you are trying to say choose a point value and see how often that player hits it. It seems like that's what's being done here, right? So like you could say 70 fantasy points and see for every single player in the field what their expectation is of hitting that value. That's what it sounds like. Correct me if I'm wrong. The short answer is that there's not an easy way to do that right now at the moment. You can kind of piece it together on a player by player basis, and do like use the histograms here as kind of a way of just eyeballing that for a player. But if you're trying to do some systematic approach to to identifying that for individual players. There's not an easy way to do that at the moment. I think it's an interesting idea. I can pass that along to the team. One thing that's helpful, without feeling like you have to spill all the beans, it is helpful a little bit to know what you're doing with this too. If we're talking about adding an additional feature or something like that, it's always helpful to hear maybe what the use case is, or how you're proceeding to use this. But no, there's not really an easy way to do that at the moment. I would say the one other thing you could do, and this is a little bit more involved, is if you download the player projections, there is a little bit more information in there, including standard deviations. You get yourself into a little bit of a tricky spot here if you start doing like a normal distribution. It's not mathematically a regression, I don't think, but you can basically make the assumption that a player is normally distributed, use their mean and their historical standard deviation, and come out with a probability of them hitting any outcome within that distribution. There are issues with that assumption with the normal distribution, like we were talking about yesterday, but I think it's at least pretty decent. That requires definitely a little bit maybe of some Excel wizardry as well. But yeah, I'll pass that along. I think it's an interesting idea, and even if you wanted to DM me, I'd be curious to hear what you'd plan on using it for, because it would help. There sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes there will be a question of somebody will come into the stream and say, "Hey, can I do this thing?" And once I hear I want to do this because I'm trying to do this, there's sometimes maybe an alternative that I can offer that helps get close, or maybe comes at that from a different direction. So would be interested in hearing that. But and then the second question was adding usage column to NBA to have a sortable column for that stat in the player pool. So a couple notes on this. This kind of question has come in before. It's probably not our goal to add in historical statistics for players like this. There are just a lot of other resources out there that do this far better than we will be able to do this. What we are going to add, and what it is our intention to add at some point, I can't speak to exactly when we're planning on having this. There's some other projects we want to put in front of this, but is custom data. So you would have the ability to basically upload your own data, whatever you want, whatever really the column is and whatever the number is for each player, but also to do clever things with that, like use it in a player filter, or view that on step 3 or on step 1, or filter by that, or set particular rules that say must have player that has X usage in a lineup, or things like that. Adding things like usage or fantasy points per minute, or historical statistics, is a bit of a can of worms that takes you down a route of becoming kind of like a basketball reference, which isn't really our goal. But if there is information that would be useful to your DFS process to have visible to you in the app, our goal is to add the ability to upload that custom and have it here. So that is on our roadmap. But okay, cool. On that note, this is kind of a quick question from Dallas, kind of similar, I think, here. He said, if I upload custom projections, can I add the option to have SaberSim and the Run Pure projections in step 3? So this is a Run Pure question. Would be a lot faster to compare high leverage plays projection by going back and forth. I think the goal, something else on our radar, is to make the column customization in step 3 have everything that is available in step 1 along with it. So short answer is no, not right now, but yes in the future. So like you could even add minutes or 3 points made or whatever you wanted here in step 3. So yeah. Unfortunate answer for right this moment is there's not a super easy way to get all that information over here, but we want to add that to the columns here in step 3. So, and then another question here from Dallas, and I see some questions coming into YouTube chat, so we will get to everything. I promise. Going to continue ripping through the rest of the questions in Slack first. He said, on a larger slate like tonight, say I play the 20 max and run a tight pool of 25 to 30 players. I know you're against taking out players. Would you up the sim variance with it being a smaller pool? I think so. I think that's a good idea. I think that makes some sense. I wouldn't say that's like a requirement. But especially, I think what I find when with talking to people who are, curating a player pool is that there is kind of an expectation to see some relatively even exposures to those players in the pool, right? If you set a player pool of 30 players, but then you build your lineups and you only actually have 22 of them showing up in your lineups because maybe some of those players aren't projected as well, right? I guess often when I hear this kind of strategy, it's coming from a place of wanting to see exposure to all of these players somewhat evenly throughout your pool. Since you are already limiting the players that are available to show up in your lineup so heavily by rolling with a pool of 25 to 30, I think you can even out that exposure a little bit and kind of get some diversity in there, which is probably also a good idea by turning it up a little bit. So what I would probably say is I would just experiment with that. Like try running it, set your pool, try running your builds at default settings and see how it looks if you change sim variance even to 10, right? How does that look? What do the lineups look like? What does that do to your exposures? And there's probably a middle ground in there that would be suitable, I guess, to what you're trying to do here. And broadly speaking, that's, I think, a really good idea with the sliders overall. When there are questions about sliders is play with it at the extremes, right? So, if you're unsure of, what happens when ownership fade is turned up, right? Turn it up to 10 and run a build and see the impact of that. And then turn it to the midpoint of what you were at by default and 10 and see what it looks like there. And then, I think it helps to show a little bit of more of what the sliders are doing and what each tick on the sliders actually does. So good question. Six Fever says, what's some good contest selection for MLB this year? I don't know yet because I don't know what the contests are going to look like until the sites get them posted. I've been pretty eagerly awaiting to see when DraftKings at least is going to post their opening day stuff. I know for football, they had their week 1 contests up like 2 weeks at least early. I don't know. I know football is a little bit bigger for them. So maybe a little bit more urgency to get the contests open for football to start filling those up. But we'll see what they have when they come out. Overall, our recommendations for contest selection. First of all, I will be putting out another contest selection video for baseball for the start of this year. Just like we did for football, just like we did for basketball. A lot of the core principles of what I talk about on this stream and in our other content will still be the same, right? You want to spread out your risk as much as possible by filling up the lowest dollar contest with as many unique entries as possible first, right? Never exceeding more than 5% of your bankroll amongst a set of correlated slates. So a set of the slates that are being played in a given day. From there, look for contests that are under $3 when possible, if you have access to them, and play contests with 1,000 effective entrants or more to minimize the impact that the most skilled players have in your contests. In other words, to increase your theoretical ROI as much as possible. I think the one addition this year is I will probably kind of more officially recommend playing smaller slates, playing turbos, night slate showdowns, things like that to spread out your risk a little bit more, to just get more lineups in play. That's something that we haven't hammered at home as much in some of our other content selection videos, but I think it's a really good idea. And we will see what the actual official contests look like. Baseball is a little bit smaller than basketball, and it gets, at least as far as I remember, it gets smaller more quickly, right? Like basketball has done a pretty good job, I think, this year, actually, especially standing up in terms of their contest sizing throughout the course of the season. Like it seems like all of the main NBA DFS contests right now are about as big as they were even near the start of the year, which is great. There is a little bit more of a fall off, so it can be hard to find all those contests that fit from an effective entrance standpoint in baseball. They also, historically on DraftKings at least, there has always been a 50-cent minimax and a $1 minimax, neither of which fit the effective entrance principles. And there's never a good $1.20 max. The $1.20 max is like 5,000 entrants, which kind of sucks. It makes contest selection at the lower stakes a little bit trickier. There are, still some good options, and we'll talk about that when I get the video out. But yeah, I think from there it'll kind of depend on what the sites end up doing. I actually think I think I like DraftKings roster construction more with 2 pitchers, but I do think FanDuel has better contests at the lower stakes, if I remember correctly, because FanDuel will have their 222 and their quarter and I think some better offerings overall at the low stakes, but we'll see. So. All right. Let's see. I'm going to hit this question real quick just because I saw it. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but it's a quick one and I saw it. So David said, this is not a dumb question. Sim variance set to 10, so a single game simulation. When generating multiple lineups, do all the lineups come from that single sim, or are they all based off their own unique simulation? They are all based on their own unique sim. So it is not, if you build 150 lineups at sim variance 10, you are not getting the first 150 optimals for a single sim. You are getting 150 unique simulations and the optimal for each of them is the way you would think about it. So on a 12-game slate like tonight, right, sim variance 10, we'll take a single game simulation from every game on the slate and print the optimal for that particular single game sim. And then the next lineup will re-randomize the sim for every game, right? And actually unique to sim variance 10 is that a single simulation cannot be chosen twice for the same game. That is only true at sim variance 10. But for example, if you get some hypothetical, if you get simulation 473 from the Denver and Washington game in your first run, that you cannot, the builder will not select that sim again in that build of lineups. So it's kind of a unique nuance there. But yes, it is a unique simulation for each lineup. So. But anyway, let's jump back here and jump back to Slack and hit this one real quick. This is from James. He said, "Hi, Jordan. It's a monster slate tonight. It sure is. I'm excited for it. When using the filter column in step 1, I pump it up to 20. Is that too high or too low for tonight's slate? Also, about the slot. Okay, well, let's start there. A couple different questions here. So we'll start with the player filter. I do some. I use the player filter a little bit too. It depends on the slate for me. It depends on kind of what is out there. A lot of times I think lately what I've been doing is I've been using this value column a little bit, and I'll kind of figure out where's that last player that I'd be interested to see in my lineups, right? And a lot of times it'll be the lowest projected player that's, maybe a better overall value play. It might be like a guy like Davion Mitchell tonight. I might put it around 19. If this was final, right, we'll probably get more value as the slate goes on, right? But often the way I'll think about it is, there might be, let's see if we can find a good example. You get down to someone like Jermichael Green, right? Projected for 17 points. And on a 12-game slate, do I want to play 17-point average projected Jermichael Green when I can get 19-point min price projected Davion Mitchell, right? That's kind of ultimately the way I think about it. So, and it depends on the slate, right? It's not even so much about slate size. It depends on the slate context. 20, for example, could be a really good number to put it at or a really bad number. If there's no value and you've set your minimum projection filter at 20, right? You may be, let me put it this way. If the best value are a couple min price guys that are projected around the 5.5 to 6x range, you could be eliminating a lot of the value that's available to you on the slate by setting your minimum projection filter to 20, right? And vice versa, there might be slates where 20 is probably never too low, but there might be slates where there's a ton of value and you might not even be getting anybody projected but under 24 points anyway. So it kind of depends on the slate to slate basis where I actually end up setting it. A lot of times I will do something like this though. I will look at the slate and I will kind of figure out where's the lowest projected value play that I want in my lineups. Maybe it's like 18 if the slate was final right now. If the slate was locking right now, maybe I would set it around 18, right? I think another way you can do this too is you can just run that test build. Actually, let's just go back to that test build for your particular contest and kind of get an idea of what the builder's doing to begin with, right? What are the lowest projected players that are showing up in lineups? So let's go look at this here and see. Scroll down a little bit here. So this is a slate where there's not a lot of value, right? And there are players showing up here. I think a sim has run since I did this, but there's, actually there has to have been, because the minimum projection would have been at 15. Let's just start a new build, actually, with the updated projections. And the other note while this is building too is I wouldn't stress too much about where this minimum projection filter is actually set, because you obviously get the opportunity to fine tune and quality control in step 3, right? You don't necessarily need to get this right all in one go here. A lot of times I just set it at a number that kind of feels right to me based on where the projections look, what the value plays look like, and I will remove a couple players from my pool if I'm seeing I'm getting exposure to guys here in step 3. But let's go ahead again and look at this and go see, what are the lowest kind of projected plays showing up here. And I think it'll help give you an idea of what's viable in that particular slate. So for a 20 max, 10 to 50K entrance, right? The lowest projected play that we're getting in our first 20 is Patty Mills, who is showing up in a single lineup. If we look at the entire pool, right? So a little bit of exposure to some of these cheaper plays here, right? Decent value play in Josh Primo here, but probably would be, comfortable kind of chopping that off at around the 18 mark, maybe where the first guy that shows up in 10% plus of your lineups is. I think that's another good way of doing it. And that'll show you, if you're making a mistake too, right? So, if there was a play that was, I don't know, if you were planning on setting your minimum projection filter at 20 or something like that, and there was a min price guy projected for 6x at 18.5 fantasy points that was showing up in 20% of your lineups, right? Like maybe 20 is too high for this slate right now. If 18% of your lineups in your pool of 500 have Justin Holiday, who's a decent little value play at 3,400, right? So, but anyway, I think we covered that enough here. Let's keep it going. Also about the sliders, I bumped sim variance down to 4 and I bumped it up to 6, but it was a little bit different when I checked my dummy builds. What do you recommend for a 12-game monster slate for tonight? For the sliders, I almost always just use the defaults. Like I would say I essentially never change these. So I would go in here and select what kind of contest you're playing. On a 12-game slate, sim variance is going to be a little bit lower, right? There are so many players in the pool. There are so many ways for people to go wrong with their lineup construction that we can kind of rely a little bit more than typical on just the average projections. But the sliders are not the best place to add value to the process. We've done a ton of work back testing them and optimizing them for certain contests. I would say unless you can tell me a specific reason why you are changing it, I would just use the defaults. So that's not to say so much that you should never change the sliders, right? There's an argument to be made. Maybe you tell me, here's a good example, right? Maybe you say, well, actually, we had Dallas's example from before, right? Dallas curates his player pool in step 1 very heavily, filters down to a very tight pool. So he's going to increase sim variance potentially to get a flatter exposure across that pool, right? Another example would be maybe you are studying the ownership projections for a very specific contest, right? Maybe you are playing single entry contests and you are making adjustments to ownership projections and spending time condensing the ownership so that you really key in to what you expect to happen in a single entry contest. And maybe there's a strong argument to be made there that you increase the ownership fade slider to get more value out of those adjustments. But all other things being equal, what are the best sliders to use? Always the defaults. And I use the defaults, I would say 99% of the time. So, yeah, so there was another part of this question here with the correlation slider. Again, something that I just leave completely alone, especially in NBA. Correlation factors are going to be a little bit lower. I'm not overly concerned with correlation in terms of how it relates to my lineup construction. Like I am in, I'm more opinionated about my lineup construction in baseball or football or things like that with the stacks I want and the stacks I expect to see. In basketball, I don't feel as strongly about that. So I'll leave the correlations alone and assume that between the average correlations and the sim variance together that I'm getting lineups that kind of make sense or have the right correlations. So, James said, thanks for showing me how to import my lineups for DraftKings yesterday. It was a big help. Yeah, I bet it was. I'm glad I was able to help. Yeah, as soon as I saw inputting lineups manually, I was pretty excited to show off the entry editor. So I am glad that's helpful. But okay. Guy Will Gamble says, if I upload custom projections and run a build, are the lineup saber score updated when a new sim is run? No. So we will never, well, I guess they could potentially be. We will never overwrite a custom projection. So if you tell us that you actually think Rudy Gay's projection is 19.54, and then some news comes out here after maybe players get ruled out for Utah and his new SaberSim projection is 28, this is still going to be the projection that is used in your builds, in your existing builds, whatever. We will never overwrite a custom projection with a sim. The underlying sim, right? So like in this case, right, what's happening here is that Rudy Gay's fantasy point output in every single simulation we have for this game is being reduced by 2 points, right? Well, if his actual SaberSim projection here changed to 28.54, right, and his underlying distribution, his underlying sim changed here as well, right? What's actually happening behind the scenes is a little bit different now. Now we're lowering his fantasy point output in every sim by 9 points if it was 28.54, right? Which could have a very minor factor on what the saber score of your lineups in the build are. But I would say that the most helpful answer here, the most general answer, is that we will never overwrite a custom projection, even if we run new sims for the game. The only exception to that is if a player gets ruled out. So if a player gets literally ruled out, their status is out, we will mark them out. We will set the projection to 0. They will be removed from the pool. So, but the main reason for that is that it's pretty easy to reset your custom projections, right? You can do it up here. You can do it on an individual player by player basis. And the last thing we want to do is overwrite the work people putting in their custom projections every single time a sim runs. So, Stanley asked a couple questions about ownership projections. He says, how are the ownership projections calculated? Is it just using the sims, or does it look at other factors as well? Does it account for the majority of the field using optimizers, which would heavily skew the ownership? The way the ownership works for the major sports and most of the other sports here, there's a little bit of sport-to-sport nuance, but especially, for NBA in particular, is we take an industry average projection, an aggregate projection. We use that as a custom projection, and then we build thousands of lineups at a very high variance setting and use the exposure to certain players that we got in that set of lineups as the ownership projection for that player. So, a couple notes on this. The first is that it does take into account kind of how the industry as a whole is thinking about a particular player. Because it is using a higher variance setting here, it is intended, or the ownership projections are in general should be thought of as for a large field GPP. You will see ownership condense pretty heavily in smaller contests and single entries and things like that onto what are perceived to be the best overall plays. Because we are using lineups for the projection of ownership, because we are basically building lineups and then using exposures to set ownership projections, I think it will pick up on higher owned players that are going to be higher owned purely because they fit into the lineup, right? Because of salary or positional eligibility. If there is value at one position, it often means that the expensive players at other positions get a little chalkier. We'll pick up well on that. I think that also does take into account this note about the majority of the field using optimizers, which I don't actually know if that's true, especially in really large field stuff. But yes, because we are essentially using a lineup optimizer ourselves to build them, it will pick up on the nuance of lineup optimizers overall here. And yeah, I guess that summarizes it pretty well. A couple limitations of the ownership model. There's a couple. The first is that because it is a model, because it is an algorithm, right? We will not pick up on narratives very well. So if there are certain very human narratives that can come into play that kind of create steam for particular players in certain situations, right? A very public revenge game can sometimes increase the ownership projections of a player. Extreme recent form issues in one way or the other, right? If a player is playing lights out or very poorly, right? The ownership projections, I think in particular, if a player is playing really poorly, our model may assume that the rational field would roster more of that player when in reality, they're going to use less of that player. Trying to think about if any others pop into my mind. I think those are some of the really big ones. I guess also, if there's a particular player that doesn't project all that well, that is getting touted pretty aggressively, that can also increase the ownership projections a fair bit. The one other thing too is that, especially for NBA, news breaks quickly, and our sims run essentially instantaneously, right? They will run about as quickly as the news breaks. The sims are often done in just a couple minutes. The rest of the industry doesn't always respond as quickly to news when there's a lot of manual updating that needs to take place. If there is news that breaks right at the last second that significantly changes the projections of certain games in the slate, we may underproject the new value plays ownership if the other sites haven't updated their projections quickly enough for us to get them. Basically, that process is automated. We move as quickly as we can on that. There's nobody behind the scenes going and downloading all the projections. That's an automatic process. But if the Hawks decided that they were resting Trae Young tonight 5 minutes before lock, which that kind of thing happens, right? And that makes now the Hawks elite value plays. That is going to be a situation where, we may not pick up on that as quickly as we should from an ownership standpoint if the other projections around the industry that we use to form that aggregate don't also update quickly. So I know there have been questions about that sometimes during the course of the NBA season, like why Bogdan Bogdanovic was a 8x value play and he was 45% owned. Why'd you project him for 3 fantasy points or 3 fantasy points, 3% ownership, right? And that's mostly a symptom of that news that came out that made him that good of a play happening like just a couple minutes before the game locked. So, but cool. Kyle Gamble said, so you're saying Ish Smith revenge games don't influence ownership projections? They can. People get into those narratives. They love revenge games. Revenge games, birthdays, playing near his hometown. People love it. We should just make narrative sim. But I saw this real quick, so I'll touch on this. Eric said, why is KD projected so low without any Irving on the floor? Just wondering, thanks. I wouldn't key in too deeply to any of the ownership, or not the ownership, the projections as they are right now. Still a lot of time left in the day, still a lot to continue to run. I would say we're never too high on Durant, to be completely honest. I think our model maybe just isn't, I don't know. Our model's never very high on Kevin Durant in general. I think we're always a little bit bearish on him relative to his price. I think, if you find that a good opportunity to make an adjustment, I think that's a great idea. But I would probably say that, the best advice I'd give is to give this a little bit more time for things to dial in throughout the day. But yeah. Okay. And then question from Stanley here. And I know there's some questions in YouTube chat that I've probably missed somewhere here. So we'll get back to those as well. Last one in Slack. You recommend turbo slates, but most of those have less than 1,000 effective entrants. Do we make an exception for turbo slates? I basically have. I think what you are doing if you're going to play these is you are opting into contests that your theoretical ROI is going to be lower, right? Your raw expected value in these contests is going to be lower because they are smaller effective entrants. but you get the opportunity to get more lineups in play. And you're going to get the opportunity to smooth out your variance and realize some of your equity that you have more quickly, even if you are not maximizing your EV. So I would say these are probably, if you are primarily interested in building a bankroll, it is to your benefit to earn back some of your equity more quickly so that you can reinvest it into DFS quickly. And if that is the case, I think it makes some sense to introduce these slates. You are going to make some sacrifices here in terms of that theoretical EV you have in these contests. So I think a very natural way to counteract that is to scale your bankroll appropriately to the quality of the contests that you can play in those slates. So, for example, for NBA, I can just tell you, having done this every single night, the main slate is always going to have the best contests. And then amongst the smaller slates, the last showdown and the night slate are going to also have pretty quality contests from an effective entrance standpoint, especially at the lower stakes, right? So I think your biggest investment should be into the main slate, then into the night slate and the night showdown, and then fill in these other contests as you want, right? With less bankroll investment to match the fact that your expected value is lower in those sharper contests. That's what I would do. That's what I have been doing. So, and again, I think, these contest selection principles are in some ways guidelines, right? Rather than laws. I mean, if your bankroll is large enough to get enough action down in a given slate, you're going to have to break some of these rules eventually anyway. I think mostly it's a matter of figuring out how you can do so in a way where you get something out of it, right? In this case, yes, you are accepting some lower theoretical EV in these smaller contests for turbos. What you are gaining is the ability to get more lineups in play that are not completely correlated to the main slate. There's a correlation to the main slate, but they're not completely correlated to the main slate. And smooth out your variance a little bit on a given night, right? You can silo off certain games so that being particularly wrong on a given game does not blow your entire night, right? You can also sometimes optimize on these 2-game showdowns like we have tonight, right? You get to, take significant advantage of the game simulations because the optimal way to play these is to use a extremely high sim variance setting. But 2, it allows you to win some equity when you're really right on a game, right? Let's say that you were, speaking of Kevin Durant, right? Maybe Kevin Durant does have a bad game, right? Maybe we're very right on the overall projection of the Mavericks and Nets game, right? You have an opportunity to win some equity on that by playing this showdown and this turbo where half of the players in that slate are playing in this game, where on the main slate, you may have not earned anything from that. So that's the way I think about it. But Stanley said, awesome. So go ham every slate. JK. Yeah. All in on the 7:30 p.m. turbo. No, just kidding. All right. Let's jump back. Appreciate everybody that's being patient with me. If you asked a question a while ago in YouTube chat, we are getting to them now, including Dante. One lineup in the 888. Whew. All right. With it being a 37 max and paying out the top 18%, do I play it more like a satellite or a 20 max GPP or in between the 150 and 20 max settings? What's the payout structure look like? Let's see. Let's go look at the payout structure. It depends on how top heavy it is. The satellite settings are something that I'm really only going to use in like really, really top heavy GPPs. So let's see. So I mean, it's fairly top heavy, but it's not too bad, all things considered. 25 to first. Yeah, no, I'd play this like a GPP. I'd use GPP settings here. I would use it exactly as you see it here. So I would do 20 max GPP. Well, actually, let's compare the 20 max and the 150 max settings. And there's 1251. So 20 max is 523, 525. If it were me, I'd probably use the 20 max settings. I don't think it's going to make an enormous difference here in your actual results. There's probably going to be a lot of shared lineups in the pool between these two settings. But because you're just playing a single lineup as well, right? I think I would probably just use like a little bit of a lower variance setting. I think you could also use something in between. There's not going to be a huge impact here, but something like this is what I would go for. So, and good luck. Take it down. Okay, back from what we were talking about before. Guy will gamble with the news thing. He said, I try to think about what the impact the news is going to have on my lineups. With Detroit, the potential of another player getting significant minutes would lower my exposure to the team as a whole. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's well said. Charles said, my biggest challenge is finding the right amount of leverage for a specific tournament. Does SaberSim take that into account when you adjust the sliders for a specific GPP size? It does. I would say primarily in the form of the ownership fade and the sim variance sliders, right? Let's talk about the ownership fade, I think, is a little more obvious, but we'll talk about that in a second. The sim variance slider, right? As you increase the range of outcomes for each player and narrow the pool of simulations you're looking at for each individual lineup, you are naturally going to get on some riskier plays, right? You're going to be less exposed to the best overall projected plays and get more exposure to maybe some plays that don't project as well on average, but have their own individual upside. That's the effect. That's one of the effects of increasing the sim variance slider. The ownership fade slider has a much more like explicit impact, where as the ownership fade slider increases, we will adjust players down that have higher than average ownership projections more as we build each lineup, right? So that's essentially how the lineup actually ends up getting made, is that we will, when we're building a lineup, we will set the player projections to what those players scored in the set of simulations that we're using for that lineup based on how big the sim variance slider is. And then we will make adjustments to each player's projection for that set of sims based on whether their ownership projection is over or above average at their position from there. And the size of that adjustment is based on where the ownership fade slider is. So I guess the answer to this is we do take that into account. And we will say, for example, in a small field single entry, right? You don't need a lot of ownership fade. You also don't need a lot of variance, right? We can rely a little bit more on the average projections. On a 150 max over 50K, right? You need to play with very high variance. Ownership fade comes up to moderate, right? So yes, it's taken into account. I mean, a very simple way of fading ownership more aggressively, if you wanted to do so, would be to just tick up the ownership fade slider a bit and build some lineups at a higher ownership fade and see what they look like, see what those lineups look like. I think you can also kind of intentionally take stands with your exposure or projections in step 3, right? Like going into a build. Let's see. Give this a second here. So we can go into a build here and look at what are the highest projected owned plays and how are we navigating those plays with our exposure and make adjustments here as well, right? You can see already, even at ownership fade 3, we have a full fade of LeBron, who we expect at the moment to be the second chalkiest player on the slate, right? Even with the field on Luka, a little bit over on these value plays, right? But, if you wanted to maybe say, I want to take a underweight stance on Rudy Gay, who we expect to be the chalkiest player. You can certainly do that here in step 3 as well. So, but it is the answer to the question as it was written. It is taken into account with the sliders as you adjust your GPP sizing. So. Brad said, when you run your initial builds where you go 0, 0, 10, what are you keying in on the most? Exposure, value? Sorry for the dumb questions. They really aren't, man. You don't even need to say that. Yeah, so I would say mostly for my research builds, when I'm doing them, again, not something I'm doing very often for NBA, but for other sports, MMA, golf, NASCAR are kind of the big 3 right now that are in play that I'm using these regularly. A lot of times I am looking at the exposure versus the ownership projection. And a lot of times I will do that after having made some adjustments to the ownership projections. I'm basically trying to see how often does that player show up in the optimal versus how much are they going to be owned, and seeing if there's any inefficiency there. So I think what is particularly useful about doing research builds in those three sports is that you basically need the optimal to win, or very close to it, right? Especially NASCAR and MMA, you basically need the optimal. Golf, you probably don't need the actual highest scoring optimal, but you probably do need very close to it. And those are really nice sports, I think, to run research builds. So, in fact, my final builds for those sports sometimes are just 0, 0, 10 sliders as well, where I've made some adjustments. So. And then some said, last night I got 0 exposure to Kyrie after doing my build. Is it best to lock a player in through step 2 in the groups rule, or is there a better way to do it? If you want to lock a player in, I think that the ideal way to do it is to do it here in step 1, clicking the lock button. The reason why is that then when you actually go to build your lineups, your entire pool in step 3 will have that player locked in, right? The alternative, I guess, let me say what the alternative is. The alternative would be doing it in step 3. If you do so in step 3, though, all you are going to do is you are going to take a pool of lineups that does not have 100% exposure to that player and lock in the best 20 that do have exposure to that player, right? So I think best practice, if you had the foresight last night to predict Kyrie's game, would have been to lock that in step 1, so that your pool in step 3 was as relevant to you as possible. So that any further adjustments you did in step 3, all of those lineups already had Kyrie in it, right? So, like, I'll show you what I mean. If we look at our pool of 500 lineups here, maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay. So if, for example, we came over here and locked Giannis in step 3, we essentially immediately reduced the size of our effective pool from 500 to 165. And all other adjustments we make to exposures here in step 3 are from a pool of 165, which limits the pool quite a bit. That's why we recommend, especially for more extreme changes, like locking a player in or removing them from your pool, you are probably best off doing that in step 1. So. Terry said, so I created 10 NBA lineups. They were ranked in order 1 through 10. I did some other sports, go back to my NBA lineups and selected that lineups, but the SaberSim rankings are all different now. Why is that? For example, 1, 2, 5, 12, 28, 38, 65, 98, instead of the 1 to 10 like I showed originally. That's probably because they knew sim ran. So if you watch up here, when we enter a build, right, this will spin. At least I think it will. Oh, okay. Well, it didn't do the spin. It happens either way behind the scenes. Every time you return to a build, we will update the player projections to what they are based on our most recent sims. So what that ultimately means here is that your top overall lineups from the pool can change as you return to the build later, right? So we want people to have the best lineups from their pool with the most information possible at that moment. You can, it seems like you've already discovered here that you can go back and look at a previous lineup set from before, and you'll get the original 20 lineups that are showing up in there. But at that point, your Saber score on those top lineups will likely be exactly as you said, right? It's likely that no longer are those lineups actually the top ones. So Terry said, so should I stick with the first 10 I got, or I look in the pools and others are grayed out that are ranked 1 through 10? I would say it is probably best to roll with the new best lineups from your pool at that point. So because that's capturing the most recent information. It is honestly the better answer here. It is best practice if news has changed, right? If your lineups are very different than they were before, coming back to a build that you built earlier, it probably means that things have pretty significantly changed in the slate. In that situation, it is best practice to start with a brand new build and build yourself a better pool that reflects the new situation, the new projections, the new simulations, and start from there. Like, for example, I mean, for NBA, right? Like, it would not be appropriate to build a build at 12:05, for example, and then return to it 15 minutes before lock and expect good lineups. At that point, you would want to start with a brand new build. So I would say it's fine to come back to a build if news hasn't significantly changed, refresh projections, use the new best 20 or 10 or however many you have, and go from there. But if news has broken, if there's been a lot of new sims that have run and things like that, you are probably better off just starting with a brand new build instead of refreshing. So. Okay, interesting question from Tamakis here in Slack. Looks like there's a bit of a discussion already budding there, but he said, am I making a mistake chasing the optimal lineup? I've been looking at old baseball slates, and the perfect lineup typically has a lot less correlation in multi-team stacks than what SaberSim wants you to build. I'm assuming that's by intention, and it's actually higher EV to just try to get close and instead of actually chasing the perfect lineup. That depends a lot on the sport and the contest type you're playing, right? I mean, a very simple way of, I think, looking at a very simple way of saying, to what extent do I want the optimal lineup, would be asking yourself, how closely do the default sliders for my contest match this? Because this is what will give you an optimal lineup, right? So you can kind of actually literally just visualize that for basketball, for example, on tonight's 12-game slate, you don't really need the optimal, right? From any standpoint, right? You don't need literally the optimal scoring lineup. It makes sense to incorporate correlation, right? You compare that to something like, let's go look at MMA, right? For example, where the default sliders are going to be this, right? It is much more likely that you need the optimal lineup to be successful in a large field MMA GPP than you do in NBA, right? Baseball, for a main slate, actually, I don't even want to go over to baseball because it's been running slow here. Golf, right? Let's do golf. No correlation in golf, right? But, right, also going to need to approach the optimal a little bit more. So, yes, for answering the baseball question in particular, right? And again, that is a generalization of using the sliders to give you an idea of the optimal strategy. It's not so much a hard and fast rule, but in baseball, there are so many players in the pool, right? There are 9 players in the order per team. On a larger slate, there are so many different combinations that very rarely is the actual optimal going to be required to win a DFS contest, or it is very rarely going to need to be required to win a contest. And it's also going to be extremely hard to build, right? It is very, very hard to build a lineup that has a reasonable expectation of having that outcome, right? So correlation ends up becoming a very valuable tool to build a lineup that has a better high chance of overall success, even if the absolute top highest end upside of that lineup comes down a tad, because actually it doesn't even really, right? But it's just unlikely to be the actual optimal. So again, at the core of the question here, am I making a mistake chasing the optimal lineup? It depends a little bit on the sport and the contest, right? NFL Showdown is generally another good example, or I would say actually most showdowns, even NBA, you are likely to need the optimal to win, probably to take first. MMA and NASCAR, I think, are 2 sports where you generally are going to need the optimal or very close, especially for large fields. Golf, again, I mentioned, is close. Most classic slates of the major team sports, you probably don't. You almost certainly don't. NBA, rarely do you need the actual optimal. Baseball, rarely. NFL, rarely. NHL, very rarely. Maybe on a very small slate, 2-game slate. So, and I think you're making a good point here, right? That you should be cautious of studying optimals and trying to learn a roster construction thing from it, because it can lead you down this path of thinking, oh, the optimal in a baseball game never has a stack, right? So I'm going to give up my stacks, right? You are sacrificing an element of upside in that sport. In that case, you're giving up correlation to mimic a roster construction that is very hard to be successful with. Where the actual expected value of that lineup over time, right? Maybe that's the better way to put it, is that the expected value of that lineup construction is lower than a correlated lineup construction, even if in the one individual outcome that you're looking at, that lineup was successful. So this is kind of at the spirit, and this is the last note I'll make on it. This is the spirit of what I've talked about before as one of the reasons why I don't like research builds for NBA, amongst other things, is that the assumption when you run a research build, right? If you run a build like this, right, you are building the optimals for that particular slate. And you are making an assumption that the percent of the time that a player shows up in the optimal lineup closely mimics, or close enough mimics, the percent of time that player shows up in the winning lineup for the contest you're playing. And I've mentioned a bunch on stream one of the reasons why I don't like doing research builds for NBA is because I think that assumption isn't very good for this particular sport. Mostly because you can just see that when you're actually building these lineups, the sim variance slider comes down to about 5, right? The percent chance of a well-projected player on average showing up in the winning lineup for even something like the quarter jukebox or the and one or the 4-point play is actually probably a lot higher than a research build at 0-0-10 would indicate, which is why I think research builds can be somewhat misleading for NBA. So it is essentially kind of a different way of answering this question. So anyway, for today, we'll go ahead and, I have one other question here from Nikhil, and this will be the last question for today. And he said, for newer sports, I typically like starting by playing around with $25 until I have enough data to show I have an edge on the sport. This usually works out with the 220 maxes on DK, the $1.25. What would you suggest for MMA in terms of contest selection, as they don't have a $1.20 max? Good question. I do the exact same thing, by the way. I think if you are kind of truly trying to be as careful, I guess, as possible, or if you were trying to like really research this as much as possible before making a decision to invest more, just play the quarter jukebox is what I think is probably the specifically correct answer there. If you want more action down, I think this $3.20 max is fine. On the bigger, this isn't a huge card this weekend, but on the bigger pay-per-view events, this contest will get quite a bit bigger and generally will be above 20K, so it fits an effective entrance principle. I also don't think the mini max is the worst contest in the world here, especially compared to other mini maxes that you'll see out there. 60,000 entrants. Again, this is another contest that gets bigger the bigger the card is, and especially on the bigger events, the pay-per-view events. So this isn't the worst contest either. But if this is truly a research tool for you and you're trying to figure out, do I have an edge? What's my top 1% equity before investing more? Then I would probably say that the like optimal answer to that is to play the quarter jukebox. Confirm that you have an edge after a sample size of enough slates to make you feel confident in that, and then invest more into probably the haymaker or the mini max would probably be what would be my recommendation. So, but awesome. Cool. Well, we will leave it right there for today. Just a little over an hour here. So again, thank you to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated, hung out with me here today. One last reminder that tomorrow I'll be having Will on to talk MMA. We'll be talking about our new MMA Sims, MMA strategy. Very excited about that overall. If you have questions about MMA DFS over the next 24 hours, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, or come and join us live and ask your questions live tomorrow. And we will get to everybody's questions and have a conversation about MMA DFS strategy. So enjoy the 12-game slate tonight. Enjoy whatever DFS you've got going on, and we'll see you all tomorrow. See ya.